So let's say you've got a loyal employee. They're smart, they're dependable, they've been with you for years. And so you're feeling grateful for them and you want to reward their loyalty and you want to give them equity to do that. And you want to maybe lock them in with that as well, or spark a sense of ownership in them that maybe you're not sure is quite there. But here's the hard truth: giving equity to employees rarely works well the way owners hope it will. And just so we're clear, this video is not about a capital raise where you're selling shares of the company. That's a different situation. Here we're talking about giving equity away to employees as a reward, or to reward loyalty. Now, the intent behind most owners' desire is generous, and I think it's admirable to want to do this. Many owners think about it. A lot of times it's just out of gratitude. But here's the paradox. The way that this usually ends up getting structured and playing out has the end result of damaging the relationship and working against the things that you were hoping to create. All right, so there are 7 basic principles or concepts that I'd encourage you to think about in terms of how you would engage with an employee where you want to show gratitude or you want to somehow lock them in. Most of these are alternatives to giving equity. There is one exception to that I think is valuable, and I'll talk about that at the end. So first of all, let's talk about the real drivers behind gifting equity. Usually there's 2. One is a sense of gratitude. Owners feel grateful for employees who help build the business that they have right now, and they want to give them something. And that's a very common response. And like, as I said earlier, I think that's fantastic. But the second one is a fear response. It's a fear that if this person goes, then my employees, my business is going to be stuck. I'm going to be in a tight spot. And so I want to somehow hold on to them and kind of catch them and grab them. Golden handcuffs, so to speak. Here's the problem with both of those, is when somebody has already been working well for you at their current relationship, at their current structure, to gift them equity has this impact of actually transforming the relationship. And it does this where it starts to become transactional in a way that it may not have been before. And that introduces a mercenary component to it. And I have seen this happen more often than not, where somebody was being gifted equity and all of a sudden their whole perspective on the business changes. And they start to think about it in terms of really this transaction. And you don't want to add that to the relationship. You don't want to create that dynamic. That wasn't your intent. You're trying to secure them, or you're trying to show them gratitude in some way. And so there's better ways to do that. The second part of this is oftentimes when we give equity, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to share the wealth in some way. Whether we're doing this to show thankfulness or gratitude, or because we're trying to lock them in, it's really a share of the wealth idea. And there are many ways that you can share profits outside of equity. The thing about equity is it does imply ownership, which implies responsibility, which also implies liability. And very few employees, when they have the opportunity to be given equity, they're thinking, great, I get more income, I get more access to some of the profits. Maybe I can make some of the decisions that I want to make around here. They don't really have the same sense of responsibility. Very few of them have any understanding or insight at all to the very common sleepless nights that entrepreneurs have experienced, where they're not sure how to make payroll the next day, where they're not sure how to manage cash flows. Most of them have no understanding of that. And they're not really necessarily willing to step into that, or they don't really appreciate what it'll take to do that. And so you don't want to introduce them to a place where they now have liability, or they have this responsibility that they didn't know they were signing up for. The key point in all of that is that your good intentions, if they're not structured the right way, don't necessarily translate into good outcomes, and you want to make sure they do. If you're facing this kind of a decision about whether to share equity or not, don't guess. Most of the time, there are far better alternatives, but when the exception applies, you do want to get it right. Go to christianmuntean.com. It's packed with tools and insights to help business owners like you scale with strong partnerships, clear systems, and fewer regrets. And you'll find what you need right at the top of the description to get there. So if you're thinking about giving away equity just to reward loyalty, I encourage you to hit pause. There are better, clearer ways to honor your team without risking misalignment, creating complications in your relationship. If you want to see how I'd structure a business from scratch in today's environment, including how I'd handle equity, watch this next. It's called How I Would Build a Business in 2025, and it's popping up on the screen now. The third point is this fallacy that if you give equity, it'll convert somebody into an ownership-minded individual, and that just won't happen. I don't know that I've ever seen it happen. There's probably exceptions out there, but I would say that people who already have an ownership mindset are going to have that regardless of whether or not you give them equity. What will happen is they tend to take on more of an entitled mindset, which is not what you're looking for. And again, it creates a misalignment in the intent in the partnership and in the relationship. And so my experience is that people who think like owners, either just because they've got a significant internal sense of responsibility for the things that they're involved in, or they're loyal to you, or whatever it's coming from, if they think that way and they relate that way, that's already there. But for people who don't have that, you're not going to create it by giving them part of the company. It doesn't turn those lights on. It won't happen. Now, the fourth point is if you want to secure somebody, then I would recommend not through giving equity, but by allowing people to have an opportunity to buy equity. This changes the relationship significantly because now they are starting to think about this as an investment, as a potential sacrifice on their part, as a risk that they're taking on, and they want to make sure they get a return for that. It changes the entire decision-making process on their side, and it requires them to think about the commitment on a different level. And so even if you don't want or need the money from the shares, for the benefit of the relationship, as weird as it might sound, you're doing them and yourself a favor by actually charging them the fair price of what those shares are worth. Because ultimately, you're not looking for people who've been somehow bribed or are thinking of themselves as mercenaries in some way. You want people who are co-investors with you in the business. And by giving them an opportunity to buy into the company, it helps screen for people who don't really want that. And because there are people who will say, no, I don't want to. Good to know. But it'll also help prime people's expectations and their approach differently and in a way that's more in alignment with what you're looking for if they are buying in. So there's one exception where I think that giving equity to somebody can make sense. And this is if they do three things. If this one individual significantly, through their contributions to the company, lifts the entire value of the company. And I don't mean value in some intangible way. I mean, if you get a valuation done, their work, their contributions, the things that they build lifts the numeric dollar value of the company. The second thing is if their work has a force multiplier effect. In other words, they improve the performance of others. They're able to make the sum of the parts much greater because of their involvement or what they're able to do. They bring enormous value to the company. And the third is if they're tightly aligned with your vision and values. There shouldn't be like kind of or mostly. They need to be tightly on. They see the vision, they want it, and they 100% represent the values of the company. They're in tight alignment with you. If they're not, you're going to end up resenting giving them an opportunity to be part of the company. But if they're the kind of person who sees the vision, they're in alignment with your values, they're able to build people, and they're able to build the entire company, then they're buying in through their efforts in a pretty unique way. And there's not a lot of people like that will perform at that level. But in those cases, if you carefully construct the agreement and you carefully communicate your expectations to them, don't assume they understand anything. Make sure you've communicated what you expect ownership looks like and make sure they sign on to that. But in that scenario, those kinds of people can be good catches through gifted equity. The sixth point is that the structure of equity needs to match the nature of the deal. So you want to have clear terms like vesting somebody's ownership, and that should be tied to performance and tied to time. So this is for the person that you've given equity to. So you don't just give them 10% of the company, you would vest them over time. So they perform to a certain standard, they get a chance to prove themselves, and you release shares to them over an agreed upon period of time. Or they hit certain performance metrics that are very clear so both sides understand when they've been hit, and that releases certain amounts of equity to them. And in that too, I would define what their governance rights are. Make sure that that's clear because now they're partners in some way. And so if it's full equity, full shares, or maybe it's not, maybe it's some kind of phantom equity, maybe it's some other structure of share, and you want to make sure that you're clear about that. What does it really mean for them to have equity in the company? And what does it mean in terms of their ability to make decisions? Make sure all of this is written down and buttoned up pretty well, because otherwise, if you don't, it'll create problems in the future. The last thing that I would do is I would make sure that, or the last thing under that topic that I would do is I would make sure that there's buyback terms available so that you have a way of possibly buying back that equity or forcing a sale back to you if for some reason something in the relationship doesn't work out. So here's the thing, here's the main point. There's better alternatives. Most employees don't actually want equity. Many of them want acknowledgement and to be rewarded for their contributions. So if they know that they've been part of helping build your success, rewarding them for that, and acknowledging them for that is the right intent and the right impulse that you have, and I would do that. But you can do that through profit sharing arrangements. You can do that through bonuses. You can do that through providing them with opportunities for new areas of responsibility, for letting them lead growth in particular areas of your company. There are many different ways that you can reward somebody for their contributions that don't tie into the legal structures of your company. And I would advise that you look at those first before you start looking at equity, just because it so fundamentally changes the nature of your relationship with that individual. And if not structured well, and it's usually not, it'll actually sour that relationship more than you'll anticipate.